All right, Jim, you know what time that is.
Good Lord, it
Or what that
sounds like
means.
rush hour at Romper Room.
It's time to romp on, to move on. Before we get to more contemporary wrestling, a quick classic wrestling topic. From the files. I've gone to the files and I pulled something from the files. This is the Brian Hilderbrand file.
Oh, no.
I have a letter here. It's not dated. Jim, which would be to Jim Melby. Here are some pictures.
Now, wait. You must explain to the new listeners in the audience, the wrestling news files is what you're digging into, that you have purchased and curated there from the various estates of Norm Keitzer and all the rest of these folks. And this is a file. Is this a file of pictures that Brian Hildebrand has sent in as a photographer, or of himself as a manager or talent?
This is the correspondence file. So any of the photos he sent in, some would be filed away, some would maybe be in the unfiled area. But this is specifically correspondence. Jim, here are some pictures from Steve Curtis of Lawler versus Bach from Louisville, Kentucky. No DQ. Result? Ref gets knockout. Bach drops Lawler groin first on top rope and pins him with feet on rope. By the way, 2 ends he puts in pins, I find interesting. Had an opportunity to talk to Bach. 3 hours. It was great. He speaks very highly of you. Take care, Brian.
Do you know why? That was the night.
Why weren't you shooting in Louisville?
Because I was already managing. That was Brian came down to spend some period of time, I can't remember if it was 5 days or a week or whatever, on the road with me in Memphis. And in Louisville, the main event was Lawler and Bockwinkel. And that's the night that I ripped. I want to say I was managing the Galaxians. That would have been early 1983. So that makes sense with Lawler and Bockwinkel. Because I was managing the Galaxians against Cowboy Jim Dalton and one of the other baby faces, and Dalton had just got there, and I didn't know that he had actual blank pistols as part of his cowboy gimmick, and when they introduced him, he was going to fire 2 of them off in the air, right? And I've got my back turned talking to Danny Davis and Ken Wayne, the Galaxians. And all of a sudden, this motherfucker fires those guns off, and I dove out of the ring for a shoot and ripped the seat out of my pants from asshole to appetite, all the way the whole crotch out on the way down, and had my head covered up. And fucking Danny jumped down next to me and said, "Hey, stand up straight. Your pants are ripped." The point is, well, here's where I was going with this, is Brian Hildebrand took a picture of Nick Bockwinkel pointing at my ripped out seat of my pants and laughing at them at the Days Inn when we dropped him off that night after the matches.
And it says here that he was talking to Bockwinkel for 3 hours. Were you there with him?
I don't know if it was 3 whole hours, but yeah, we rode Nick over to the hotel, and that's probably stopped and got something to eat with him. Because a couple of times when Bockwinkel came in, I've talked about it. I was able to have dinner with him one night at the Kingfish. Not the Amos and Andy character, but the restaurant.
You know, we assume everyone knows who Brian Hildebrand is. Brian Hildebrand was referee Mark Curtis, first in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. He was a manager on the Indies before that, trained as a wrestler, but famous as a referee, Mark Curtis in Smoky Mountain, and then in WCW, maybe the most popular referee. Really, when you think about it, maybe the most popular referee of a long period of time. He was really, the fans got behind him.
Yeah, not only with the fans, but with the boys. All the boys love Brian, too.
And, of course, he was Mark Curtis. He was never Brian Hildebrand. He was Mark Curtis. I think his middle name was Curtis, and he said he was always a Mark. So that's how he got the name. It says here the pictures were from Steve Curtis. Is that...
I think... I don't know whether if that's another assumed name, because he took the pictures. I think I have some that he took that night of me and my guys. But I don't know why he was using Steve Curtis as a photographer, unless that may be a period of time where he was doing a lot of independent managing in West Virginia and Eastern or Western Pennsylvania, and he may not have wanted Mark Curtis to be seen in a byline as a photographer.
I have a letter here to Brian Hildebrand from Jim Melby, December 18th, 1979. Hi, I just thought I would drop you a few quick lines and close as a copy of Wrestling News number 57 and a check for your 3 stories. I hope you like the way they turned out. I will be using your story on the Huntington card in the 3rd issue of Ring. Please read over the enclosed form letter and contracts. Sincerely, Jim Melby. And attached is a receipt, a check for $50 to Brian Hildebrand from Pro Wrestling Enterprises.
And that was top pay for Norman and Jim back in those days. So they must have been impressed with Brian's stuff.
How did that compare? You were shooting for all the different magazines. Now, again, you kind of got yourself into a nice position of leverage, but not counting Japanese magazines, the American magazines, and there were still a lot at that point. How did they pay?
And I can't speak for all of them because even with my wide reach, with the Wrestling News magazine, at first it was just a mere pittance. And then I started, Norman would say, can you please shoot a special color slide for me for a centerfold or a cover or whatever, blah, blah, blah. But if you got a check for more than $50 or $100 at any one time for a number of things from them, that was significant money. With London Publishing and Bill Apter's magazines, they had different deals with the photographers. As I've mentioned in the past, sometimes they would just pay a photographer a flat fee to go to, if it was Bill Otten was in Florida, well, go up to the Omni and shoot and just send us all the film and we're going to pay you X amount of dollars for this trip. But since I was using them for the programs here, for the concession stands here, for multiple purposes, Bill would just have me send stuff either that he wanted specifically or that I thought that they would be able to use. And if they used the prints, they sent me a check. So they never got my negatives or whatever. But that was, that's still maybe twice as much. I think I got $250 for shooting a color centerfold of Lawler for Pro Wrestling Illustrated in 1982. I think that, but it still wasn't ridiculous money.
And what about the Japanese mags?
Well, the Japanese magazines, I might not make as much from them as I did from Apters, but it was more per picture. I knew who they liked. And I would send those to Koichi Yoshizawa, if the Funks came through, or pictures of guys with belts, or anybody that, had been to Japan before, was familiar to the Japanese audience. I just sent him a stack of prints and they'd send back, checks for not only the magazines that they were in, but checks for $200 or $300. And this was 1979, 1980, 81. So that wasn't bad.
I have a letter here from Jim Melby to Brian Hilderbrand, February 5th, 1980. Dear Brian, hi. It was good hearing from you. I'm returning your story on Benello and Scott. I've never heard of these guys. I doubt if they would be of interest to my readers.
Oh my God.
Indirectly, Terry Justice is doing some stuff for Eddie Gilbert for Bill Apter. He called to explain to me that Eddie had given Apter permission to reprint stuff from the club calendar. Yes, I did see Darla in Kansas City. We had
Darla Staggs was one of the smart fans in Kansas City, one of the 5 or 6 of them back in those days.
We had a few drinks with some of the wrestlers and some fans, and you had better believe that I'm all set to taxi down that terminal in Atlanta. Sincerely, Jim Melby. I'm not exactly sure there.
I think they were talking about the Atlanta upcoming Wrestling Fans International Association convention. That would have been the summer of 1980.
Again, we don't want to go too long with this. This is something we could always return to, but going a little forward in the folder here, I have an envelope postmarked November 30th, 1983, to area close-ups, care of the Wrestling News, from Brian Hildebrand, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Mount Troy Road. Mountain State Wrestling. Run shows in Morgantown and Terra Alta, West Virginia. Recognized champions, West Virginia champion, J.W. Snakeman Hawk. The World Junior Heavyweight Champion, Zoltan the Great.
That's Kenny Jugan.
And the West Virginia Tag Team Champions are Bill Berger and Buckwheat Jackson. The big news here, is the feud between manager Greg Punk Rock Mason and Mark Curtis. And at this point, Curtis has 2 S's at the end of it.
Yes.
Curtis refereed a few shows, and Mason tried to take a few shots at the self-proclaimed Master of Disaster, who is now hearing cheers as he feuds with the manager. Curtis is teamed with Mike Savilli and Buckwheat Jackson to get at Mason and his protege Zoltan and Hawk. Other wrestlers in the area, Buddy Donovan, The Beast, The Bulk.
The Bulk, yes.
The Bulk.
He was a giant fat guy. You never would have guessed.
Bob Beecher, and Rusty King of Pain Jones. That's all the news for now. Sincerely, Brian C. Hildebrand.
And that was his Brian Curtis Hildebrand was his full name.
Then he also sent along the results for the card in Altoona for World Championship Wrestling, November 3rd, 83. Les Thatcher beat Joe Lightfoot. Ron Garvin over Paul Ellering by DQ. Road Warriors over Wrestling 2 and Pez Watley. Brett Wayne over Jake the Snake Roberts by DQ. And the main event in a cage, Tommy Rich beat Buzz Sawyer, reported to be a sellout. Promoter Gene Dargan is doing great in Pennsylvania with WCW wrestlers. Next card, 11:30 in Johnstown.
Home of the Flood. That was Johnstown, Pennsylvania. That old building was probably my least favorite facility anywhere in the state of Pennsylvania. What a dump. And you could see where that town could be flooded real fucking easy with a catastrophe like that.
That's one of the things I love about the Norm Keizer magazines, especially from that period. It's the only look you get in a lot of cases of some of the smaller, not even territories, but you want to talk outlaw groups.
Yeah.
Guys running shows with skinny wrestlers and wrestlers you haven't seen in a while and people you don't know who the hell they are. But there's more reports of that stuff in those magazines. I mean, you read about Randy Savage in there before you read about him anywhere else.
Well, and see, that was because Norman, for a lot of that time with the wrestling news, ring wrestling was a different thing. And later on, he got newsstand distribution. But the wrestling news was primarily sold in the arenas by the promoters. And so he tried to cover as much as he could, because if you didn't have any of the local guys, and like, even then, though, you could only go so far, like Bonello and Scott, right? We're not exactly household names, but the more he covered, the more promoters would want to get, well, send me 50 of your magazines so I can sell them at the matches. And he would give the wholesale price to the promoter, and then blah, blah, blah. That's why that I started doing my own magazine in the Memphis territory, because originally he sent magazines to Pat Malone and Christine Jarrett, the Wrestling News, and I started sending pictures and stories for them so that the Memphis fans would want to buy those magazines in the arena. But then gradually it became, well, there's only 4 or 5 stories of the Memphis guys in this particular Wrestling News, because he's got to cover, Atlanta and this territory and that territory. So I started doing a little 16-page magazine, Championship Wrestling magazine, that he printed for me. And it was all Memphis guys. And I wrote stories, took the pictures. But then after the first 3 of them, he said, well, now everybody's buying your magazine. They're selling out and nobody's buying the Wrestling News. So how about, for the same price, I'll print you, God damn, what was it? Was it a 48-page magazine or whatever, with all of the Wrestling News advertising in it? And if you'll just sell those, so that way I don't lose my advertising customers. I was like, okay, so that he doubled the size of the magazine and only put in half again, as many pages as ads. So I had all kinds of space to fill up now for nothing extra. But that was the deal, is if he couldn't sell in the newsstands, he had to cover all of the territories that he could, so the promoters would buy the magazines and sell them at the matches.
Well, Jim, we will close this edition of From the Files with this final thing here because it clarifies something earlier. A typed letter from Brian C. Hildebrand, May 1st, 1983. Dear Jim, once again Jim Melby, as always, I hope this letter finds you in the best of health, mind, and spirits. And Brian still had his spelling issues even then. In other words, I hope that you will be taxiing down the runway into the open space of the mind any day now. My, what college does to a person. Sorry that I haven't written sooner, but school is a bitch. And now I'm finished with it for another year. So now I could sit back and get some articles written and get it sent out. Listen, when I graduate, if I graduate, do you know of any promotion that needs anyone for anything? I mean that as long as I've been in the business, I've done just about everything except suck Barnett, who he misspells the name of. He adds an E at the end. Is there any positions opening up in the magazine? Keep your ears open, please. I might have an opportunity to be the commentator for the ESPN PAFO show. Huh.
Oh my God.
But I'm afraid of being blackballed from the rest of the wrestling world. Let me stop there for a second, because this is May 83. I had never heard any rumors or anything about the PAFOs getting ESPN.
Well, and that's what jumped out at me. And because Brian was working with the Outlaw Promotions, the early independents, in West Virginia, there really was no territory except Crockett shows in West Virginia at that point. And, you know, Western Pennsylvania, Johnstown, Pittsburgh, etc. A lot of those guys would go to work for the PAFOs, ICW, even if only to do jobs on TV or just, you know, whatever. So there was some back and forth. I don't know that there was ever any legitimate chance or close chance, or even talks have not been uncovered between the PAFOs and I'm telling you, folks, and again, I love territory wrestling, but their television show was low budget. I don't see how that ever would have been possible at that stage of the game. They were almost ready to go out of business. But was Angelo telling people that he talked to somebody, or did he talk to somebody and he was just telling them his part of the conversation to get people to think, you know, hang on, we got something big coming? That might be possible.
Let me go back to this letter from Brian Hildebrand, May 1st, 1983. I've been reffing for the WWA occasionally, but I have to lay off for the summer due to me being in PGH.
Pittsburgh.
And plus the fact that I broke my foot moving back. And guess what? Bruiser, in his infinite wisdom, has me booked for a number of dates in Indiana. What's even funnier is that he won't give me his number. So how am I supposed to get a hold of him? I called Colt to tell to Brew what my condition is.
And that would have been Bobby Colt, who at the time Bruiser was using as his top heel because they were about to go out of business. And Bobby Colt knew Brian from the Indies.
I don't know. I still think I'm going to get heat. So what's up with you? Done any more traveling to any exotic wrestling areas? Do me a favor. If you see Peggy Lee anywhere down the road, give her my regards. I have included to you, the mighty of all editors, a story for any one of your magnanimous, I've been listening to Paul Ellering too much, publications. I've got a lot of stuff from the WWA, so you won't have to worry about that area for a while. Well, it's about the time that I get back to what we call work here, so I could dream up a couple more stories. Take care and keep in touch. Brian, and then in parentheses, Steve Curtis, Steve Cutis. You see, I can't even spell my alias right. P.S. Why don't you come on down to Pittsburgh some weekend? It would be great to see you again. And there it is.
That was, Brian was always wanting to get in the business. Anything that when he would come down and go on the road with me, he did it twice in Memphis when I started, and then later on toward the end of the run, he spent a week down there shooting pictures with us in Louisiana when I moved there. And then, when I started working for Crockett, we went to Pittsburgh regularly. So I've told the stories about when Brian's dad was a Pittsburgh cop, and he would drive, me and Bubba or me and the Midnight Express to the building, from the airport hotel and then back, and we'd eat at the Eaton Park. And goddamn, coming out of the Civic Arena one night, it was me and Bubba, and Brian and his dad was driving, and the people swarmed the car, and his dad just got out with his police gun and held it up over his head. It's like, oh, goddamn it.
Holy shit.
People fucking scattered and climbed lampposts and everything, and off we went.
His dad was such a nice guy.
Yeah, but old Reach, but he was a licensed to kill kind of individual up here in Pittsburgh. But yeah, Brian always wanted to be in the business, and he did everything, literally everything, as he said.
Yeah, you see, there's a couple of interesting things there. One is, I think a lot of people, and I did for a long time too, I didn't, think about it too much. When you hear the stories about Dominic DeNucci's school, you always hear Cactus Jack and Shane Douglas and Brian Hildebrand, almost like they came up together. He was already there for a long time.
Yeah.
He had been he was one of the trainers, wasn't he?
Yeah, because, think about it. You've seen pictures of video of Mick Foley's first match in the WWF as a TV jobber. What was that, 85, 86 with the Bulldogs?
86 or early 87, but probably
something
86.
Like that.
86, I think.
Well, yeah, that's when Mick was just breaking in. Brian had been trained by Dominic. As you saw those letters there, he'd been since the late 70s. When I met him at the 79 WFIA convention in Memphis, he had already been wrestling and managing on these little independent shows. He had pictures of him. The Incredible Bulk guy was like 5'2" and 400 pounds. And the exact opposite. He and Brian standing next to each other looked like the number 10. And, he'd already been doing it. So yeah, he was one of the guys, and he knew he wasn't going to be a full-time wrestler in any major promotion, but he did it because he loved it. And he kept going to the school so he could work out with all the guys as they came through and came up and everything.
So this letter is 1983. He's, asking for any help he can get from Jim Melby or the Wrestling News in terms of a job anywhere in wrestling, doing anything other than sucking Barnett. It's interesting, and even in 83, people behind the scenes were making jokes and writing about that.
Oh, they were doing that in 73, but go ahead.
But you would end up hiring him with Smoky Mountain Wrestling in 92. And he probably didn't think of it. Well, who knows what he thought. I was going to say he probably didn't think of it as his big break, but it ended up being his big break. That's a long time from 1983. What do you remember about when you hired him? I mean, was it immediate, I'll drop everything and be there?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't an immediate because I wasn't just giving him like a deadline of next Friday. And see, remember, he had still kept doing photography all through the 80s. For a variety of the magazines. He was also managing and working on independents. There's tape out there of me and Stan Lane against Mark Curtis and Jerry Lawler on one of Dennis's shows in Cherry Hill, New Jersey from 1991. And he managed Bad Company, Paul Diamond and Pat Tanaka against the Midnight in 89 in that show in Ohio when we were on break from WCW. So he had still been doing everything he could around the wrestling business. And finally, when I knew that we were moving forward with Smoky Mountain Wrestling, I called him and I said, hey, for the first 3 months, we're going to do a weekend where we do a TV taping and then a couple spot shows because the guys are in town. And then we're going to try to do a bigger schedule, but you'd have to move to Knoxville. He said, no worries. And at first, his dad came down with him on those first weekends because his dad was his number one fan and videotaped all of his matches and everything. So his dad and he came down for the weekend trips, and then he scouted out places to live. And when we were ready to go, not full time every day of the week, but fuller time, he already was able to move down.
Well, there it is. Brian Hildebrand from The Files, referee Mark Curtis. And we'll definitely do this again from the files, but that was a classic wrestling break.